treasure seekers? This is Blake coming to you live from New Mexico, and joining me as always from Washington State, it's Bryn and Cody. How's it going, guys?
Good evening. It's going to be an interesting chapter to cover.
Cody,
Going good. Going good.
I called out both of you, so you have to both respond to me.
Yes. But you also asked how's it going, and Bryn didn't really say how it's going. She just said it's going to be an interesting chapter.
I'm trying to gather myself. I was frantically trying to prepare for this recording, so excuse me.
Neither one of us really answered your question. We're doing well. We're doing well. Blake, how
Oh,
are you?
okay. I'm excellent. Thank you. Thanks for asking. Getting a little bit of snow right now, so we'll see
Oh,
if
really?
I get work
Jealous.
canceled tomorrow. Ooh.
Ooh.
Snow days.
Snow day.
Adult snow days. Yay.
Jealous.
I know. All
Is
right.
that the kind of thing over there where they'll cancel it if there's like half an inch of snow, or you normally need a pretty good amount of snow?
No, we usually need probably like 6 inches or more to get a cancellation. So we'll see. We'll see. The plows are already out, so it just depends on whether or not it continues to snow and they can't keep up. So we'll see. We'll see.
We'll keep our fingers crossed for you.
Thanks. Yeah, I have quite a bit of writing to do, so I would still work, but I just be able to work from home. So. All right, this is There's Treasure Inside, the unofficial podcast. We're going to be covering Jon Collins-Black's chapter 11 in the book There's Treasure Inside today. But first, why don't we kick off with our normal segments? No news today to report in my mind, so why don't we just get right into some goodies with Horseshoes and Hand Grenades. Cody.
All right. Yes, this is going to be an interesting Horseshoes and Hand Grenades. It's Joy's Serenade, a working theory I've got going right now with Joy's Serenade. I've not fully given up on it yet, so it mostly meets the conditions of Horseshoes and Hand Grenades, but I'm still kind of still going back and forth. Haven't totally given up hope on it completely.
Will you describe what Joy's Serenade is for maybe people that don't know?
I will describe what
okay.
Joy's Serenade is. It's a it's a poem in the back of the book. It's like one of the last pages in part one, and doesn't seem to really be associated with any of the chapters. It's just like a random standalone poem that I guess I'm assuming is written by Jon Collins-Black. I don't think it says like by Jon Collins-Black at the end, but it doesn't say by anyone else either. So I'm gonna assume it's by him.
Can I interrupt for just a second?
Yeah.
So Joy's Serenade is actually at the end after all the part 2 boxes as well. Like physically in the book.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So I just want to make sure that's clear.
I think you're mostly referencing the ebook. Is that right, Cody? So like,
yeah, exactly. That's what I was just gonna say. So Joy's Serenade is at the end of part one. If you just buy the part one ebook, but I guess I didn't go back and recheck where it was in the physical book, because you're right. In the physical book, I remember it being at the very end. So it's a very standalone thing, and maybe it is interesting in some way that the Joy's Serenade is included in part one on the ebook and not with any of the part twos. So I do want to start with a quick disclaimer, and that is this theory basically completely relies on it being allowed for JCB to put clues to the part two boxes, maybe not necessarily in part one, but in Joy's Serenade. So wherever you would classify Joy's Serenade being, I would have classified it as being in part one, because on the ebook, it came with my part one ebook. But like we just said, it's in the back of the physical copy. If you don't think that that's allowed for some reason, then you're not going to like my theory. All right. So the gist of my theory is that I think that potentially that Joy's Serenade, the poem itself, is written from the perspective of Jon Collins-Black after hiding all of the boxes, basically after hiding the lion's share box. And then my theory would believe that that's the last box he's hidden, and that he hid each of the part 2 boxes sequentially the way that they're listed in the book. Those 4 other boxes, the way that they're in the order that they're published. So the part with that theory that I'm most interested in then is the first 4 stanzas. And my theory is that each of those first 4 stanzas is like 1-to-1 correlation with each of the 4 part 2 boxes, again, in the order that they're published in the book. So I will start by going through kind of the highlights from each of the 4 stanzas here real quick and talk about what kind of led me to think, hey, these seem like they really link up well with those part 2 boxes in that order. So the first stanza talks about finding music in a poem. Then obviously the first box is the Forrest Fenn box, which like almost all of the clues you would think are in that Forrest Fenn poem. So poem seems like an obvious link to me. Stanza 2 is I'm a little bit less confident in, but I think it still works, especially once in the kind of the full context of all 4 stanzas. So stanza 2 talks about a conductor, and then also talks about a flutter of excitement. So I think the conductor, I think there's a consensus that the Pokemon box, which is the second box, is in the southeast. So it makes me think of kind of like the big conducting street bands, or alternately, since it's the Pokemon box, it could be an electric type Pokemon. And then he also talks about the different types of Pokemon. It seems very heavily weighted towards bug type Pokemon. In that part 2 box, the Pokemon box. So the flutter of excitement, I think kind of the word flutter to me is a strong bug type word. That one's the one I'm least confident in. Go ahead, Blake.
I also want to mention it does use the word coda in the second stanza. While the coda is incomplete, there's a flutter of excitement around. Coda makes me think of codex and like a Pokédex. So that's a bit of a stretch, but I'll just give you one nugget there to fill in your theory a little bit.
One flake.
One flake.
Yeah, I appreciate it. The more confirmation bias I can get, the better. So stanza 3 then would be correlated, according to my theory, with the past and future box. It talks about straight edge, and it talks about a turning square, and aligning a proper point. All of those to me seem associated with like a grid, not necessarily a word search, but the word search is published in like a grid form in the book. So I think there's a lot of words that could be associated with a grid. So I felt like that one lined up pretty well. And then the last one's probably the most obvious. The last one being the Appalachian Trail box with the map. And it says you can take your own path and X leads the way. That one's just basically talking about your classic map. And there's the classic map in that part 2. So that's kind of how I came to the theory of, hey, maybe this Joyous Serenade is written in this perspective, and it's kind of him reflecting on each of those 4 boxes as he hides them. And then the second half of the Joyous Serenade poem, which I'm not going to talk about much in this segment, would then be him kind of hiding the lion's share box and leaving and just like being all like looking back on it and happy about it and writing the poem. So assuming that, if this was true, if you kind of want to go down this path, I think that the next steps for me, or for anyone else who was interested in this theory, would be to think about how each of those 4 stanzas could point you in a direction of potential clues for each of those 4 boxes. So I'll walk through that for each of the 4 stanzas real quick here too. So the first one talks about a note and music, and is directly kind of talking about how that ties in with the poem. He says, we may find music in a poem. So I'm interested in, I already have, and I'm going to continue to look at possible like musical references, or if there's any sort of other musical clues within the poem for the Forrest Fenn box. someone who knows more about music might be able to pick more stuff out in there. Stanza 2, he talks, this is the Pokemon box then. He talks about a conductor with a trace of a baton. So I thought, I've been looking at like maybe statues of famous conductors, maybe pointing a baton in a certain way. I should say actually the full text there is, our conductor, as with the trace of a baton through the air, gives direction. So the conductor is giving direction. So my first thought, like I said, is maybe like a statue of a conductor pointing in a certain direction. That might be something interesting. For stanza 3, he talks about using a straight edge and turning a square or any arc to align things at a proper point. That one's really interesting to me because I know that I and a lot of people have spent a lot of time looking at the word search. So I think it could, if this theory were true, it could give some new perspective or new ideas on how to approach the word search. And to me, it would be kind of turning a straight edge, almost like a clock, around the word search. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. Is there any inputs where we could use that input and turn a straight edge kind of circularly around the word search to pick out certain letters? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I haven't seen anybody with a solve that kind of uses circular pattern. And so the arc, I think, might be super helpful if your theory holds true. And thinking about what we're considering our coincidence of the day later this episode, I'm rethinking that as a coincidence of the day. We will discuss later, I guess.
And the other reason that I like, sorry, go ahead, Bryn.
Oh, I was going to say also this, like the clock component, rotating that aspect also plays into the theme of past and future as well.
Exactly.
Time.
And that's something we've talked about, is how we like a lot of people solve so far for the past and future box and word search, but we haven't seen anything that really ties into the theme. And we think that tying into the theme is going to be important. So yeah, that's a good point too. And then another reason I kind of like the clock idea for that one is that there's like the X, not X, but almost like plus sign in the center of that word search made out of the O's, which would give you like, kind of draws you directly into that center point with around which you would revolve, right? So more to look into there. Obviously none of this I feel great about, and that's why it's in Horseshoes and Hand Grenades and not a separate video about, hey, look, I've solved it.
Not us revealing the box.
Yeah, exactly. And then stanza 4, there's if you believe in the theory and you believe that stanza 4 would be offering clues for, at this point, it would be the Appalachian box. You get the lines, simply follow shimmering circles of gold. So there's lots of different things that could mean. And then also the last line there is, there may be magic in the water, but the pike are rather all around. This is kind of related to it. I just want to touch on it since we're talking about that line anyway. But in the book, or at least in the ebook, I think it's in the book too.
It is.
Literally directly before Joy's Serenade, he's talking about other treasures that didn't get captured in any of the chapters of the book that I just wanted to touch on real quick. And I think it's on page 204. He's talking about some Viking jewelry. And then at the very end, go ahead.
It's 236 of the hard copy. Page 236 of the hard copy, 204 of the ebook.
Oh, wow. Interesting. We'll have to look into that some more too. But either way, he says at the end of that, he says, on a side note, one of my favorite childhood books, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, was inspired by the Viking myth of Andvari's Ring. It's an interesting tale if you have the time to read it. So if you do read that, I'm pretty confident that that is what he's referencing. That story is what he's referencing when he says there may be magic in the water, but the pike are rather all around. So if you didn't know that, go read that Andvari's, what was it? Andvari's Ring tale. And I think that you'll come to the same conclusion there.
Ooh, a little homework for the listeners. Can't give away all your secrets.
It's a short read.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
That's
so a lot of information there, and again, it kind of all is predicated on the idea that you have to believe that you can get hints to part two from things outside of part two, which I'm not even sure of yet. But it just seemed like too many coincidences in my mind to not be at least a theory.
a working
And I'm
theory.
normally, yeah, at least a working theory, and I'm normally pretty critical of theories and of myself, and it seemed like they lined up pretty well. So yeah, questions, comments?
I've got two. That's all right. First, I guess a request for the listeners. If any of the listeners have a ebook for one of the part two treasures, I guess it'd be super interesting to know if Joy Serenade is in the part two ebooks, because that would lend a lot of credibility to your theory right now. And I don't think any of us have bought the part two ebooks. Is that correct?
I have a part two ebook.
Oh,
Oh.
right.
I'm double checking right now, but I'm 99% sure there's no Joyce Serenade in there.
Belay that order, listeners.
Well, I mean, I think it also, I don't think it necessarily rules it out because it would still be, there would still be all the aspects later in the poem that would be part of a lion's share solve, where the other ones, like, you wouldn't necessarily have to tie them in, right? I think it's just kind of like a bonus to be able to.
I guess I would argue that the uh, as the turning square or any arc, at least for the the part two treasure past and future box, if that's giving a hint that we need to use an arc, and I feel like that would be critical to knowing from the poem. But actually, kind of like what you said, maybe it's just the hints to the lion's share components of those boxes, if there are any, that might be included if this theory holds true.
So there's no Joyce Serenade in my copy of one of the part twos.
Mm.
Yeah, and so yeah, to touch on what you were just talking about, I think there's kind of two camps right now. One of them is the he said, JCB said that all of the part two stuff is standalone. You don't need anything but what's in part two. So there is nothing outside of what's in part two that is applicable to the solve. And I think the second camp is the way he worded it leaves some room for interpretation where maybe he gave enough hints that you could find it with just part two, but then there can also be additional hints outside of part two. So I think those are kind of the two different camps, and this would rely on it being kind of this theory would rely on it being the second of those.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, I think I'm part of the camp that would be upset if these poems were part of a part two box solve and I didn't have access to them if I bought the one ebook. I would be a little miffed about that, to say the least. So it seems risky to me. But
Yeah, and I'm not arguing against you. That's why it's in my horseshoes and hand grenades, and not like I said, I'm not jumping up and down and saying, "Hey, I got something."
okay, fair. I have one more comment, but I'll let Bryn discuss if she had points first.
Oh, I guess I just still think like it's still not clear enough where that line is drawn. That I think like there could be reference from those stanzas to the part two boxes uh, that could then, in a roundabout way, tie into the lion's share solve, bringing it all together. Like I think this poem is his opportunity to bring the whole book together in a conclusion and like put a bow on it. So I think even if you aren't using these stanzas to help solve those part two boxes, there could be components of those solves reflected in these stanzas that get applied to the lion's share as well. So I think there can be overlap and independence between part one and part two at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I actually have two more things real quick that you just made me think of. One of them is, I guess ultimately you have to realize that part one and part two were written by the same guy at the same time doing the same research. So I think there's going to be thematic overlaps for sure. It's just going to become a matter of like, are there very distinct, discrete clues in like part one or part two or not? And then the second thing is, I don't want to say anything too disparaging about the whole like publication process, but I know that he obviously put 5 years of thought into creating this book. And it does seem like then the ebooks were like, oh my gosh, we have to get more copies out to people as soon as possible. So is there maybe some room for then like, oh, Joyce Serenade really should have been included or something else should have been included? I don't know. There's a lot of question as to what are the rules here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's a good point. Haste makes waste.
Yeah,
All
we
right.
saw that with the reality of it in the Kindle version.
Right. That's a good point. Good piece of evidence for that. Yep. All right. I just have one more comment. Thinking about Cody's theory here about the first four stanzas being from the part two boxes, if we see what's remaining, the leftover three stanzas, there's actually 21 lines in those three stanzas. And there's 2 gaps in between the 3 stanzas. So that would amount to 23 things, which there are 23 chapters in the book. And we know that, I believe in the introduction of the book, he says almost all of the chapters have clues towards the lion's share treasure. And so maybe this is a hint if we could correlate any of these individual lines in the remaining 3 stanzas to chapters. That might give us a clue as to which chapters hold information and which, in this case, 2 chapters don't. So if we think about, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The 9th line would be a blank one, which is, do you guys remember which chapter that is off the top of your head?
Chapter 9?
Yeah. Is that one of the ones we didn't like?
I think it was the one we didn't like. It was...
Chapter 9 is the Golden Chalice, actually.
We didn't like that one.
About the, about the, I forget what it was called. De Juntar.
Yeah, the
Chavin de Juntar.
The spooky temple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that was the first one we thought seemed weird and out of place. So maybe.
Okay. Anyway, something to look into, but further for myself and anybody interested, I guess.
So what's your potential theory there, Blake?
That each line corresponds to one of the chapters, may or may not be in order. And by line, I mean the remaining 21 lines plus 2 gaps between the 3 stanzas.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that's how we would identify the chapters that do have clues and the ones that do not?
Possibly. All right. A lot to think about there, I think. Cool. I really like that, Cody. Should we get into Mailbag?
Mailbag. We've got mail.
Thanks again to Rashawn for that soundbite for our mailbags. You don't have to hear me go mailbag. Today we're going to be talking about an email that we received from Scott, and coincidentally has to do with Joyce Serenade as well. A couple pieces to put together here. We had discussed in the Amelia Earhart chapter episode the phrase bend a phrase, quote unquote, bend a phrase, and had some discussion about, I think I'd picked that out maybe as my Forrest Fenn Picked Nugget, actually. Had some discussion about how that's a weird phrase to use. And when I Googled it with quotes, specifically to look for other references to this term, bend a phrase, there was really nothing even on the internet or anybody that used that particular 3-word phrase. And so I thought that quite odd. So Scott actually wrote in and talked about bend a phrase, and I'll read a little bit verbatim here. The line bend a phrase gets even more suspect when you compare it to the line in Joy's Serenade. And this is in the kind of the latter 3 stanzas that you didn't cover, Cody. It says in Joy's Serenade, quote unquote, the haiku curls a little further on where few have seen it, i.e., bending a phrase versus curling a haiku. And he says verbatim, and wouldn't you know it, turns out the poem in the dust jacket is a haiku. And I had not made that connection at all. And so I have my dust jacket here. I'll read inside the dust jacket. There is a little hidden haiku, which we had found. That was not news, but that it's a haiku, I didn't actually put that together. So it says, and you can count the syllables along with as I read. Be solid, have grit. 5 syllables. Be solid, have grit. Sparkle even as you pine. 7. Here lies a joy divined. 5. So there is a haiku in the dust jacket that I think is referenced by Joy's Serenade, as Scott points out. So I found that really cool.
Isn't Here Lies a Joy Divined 6?
Yeah, that's why I read it. Here lies a joy divine. Divine.
Oh, that's a stretch. Is it?
Here.
So it's very close to a haiku, if not a haiku.
I love how you ask the audience to count along with you and then just try and clear your words.
Count along because I said divined. That's one syllable. Anyway, I think that has to be a reference to Joy's Serenade section here.
It sure seems like that should be the intention.
Yeah, and then he says, quote unquote, curls a little further on where few have seen it also parallels nicely with his advice on this chapter to go where others have not, around the next corner. And I think that's referencing the Amelia Earhart chapter, but I'm not 100% sure about that, full disclaimer. Anyway, I don't have anything beyond that other than him pointing out that reference to Joy's Serenade, which obviously fits nicely with your Horseshoes and Hand Grenades today. So thanks to Scott for pointing that out.
Did he also point out that the dust jacket bends around the book?
I don't think he specifically mentioned that, but maybe you guys figured out that connection when we got that email.
Yeah, so, that seems like an interesting part because he's kind of JCB's kind of, I can't remember the exact wording, but he's talking about the haiku itself bending. So the fact that it's on the dust jacket that bends around the book seems like an interesting addition there.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the fact that it's not the 6 syllables in the last line, you lost me there pretty bad.
No. It's gotta be the reference, I feel. I'm very bullish on that.
All right, we'll have to agree to disagree. To me,
right.
he would have just used 5 syllables if he wanted it to be a haiku. Not close enough to being a haiku.
Here lies a joy divined. All right, agree to disagree. Fine, Scott, if you want to.
I'm in the middle.
All right, got 3 temperatures here. Scott, if you want to.
Scott's really causing a rift in
just write privately to me, and we'll chat. Leave these yahoos out of it.
No, I'm more on the side of yes, but I agree that it is strange that it wouldn't be a perfect haiku.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Scott.
Okay, well, Cody's the one who also thought Canyon Round had 0 significance.
Canyon Round. No. All right. We need to move on. I'm getting heated.
Okay, Discord Detectives is next. I'll be handling Discord Detectives today, so since I am easy to get along with. My Discord Detectives today is based on a message in the Discord, the Calazar's Discord, Calazar's Grand Adventure. There's a user in there named Froggy. He also is a content creator. He has a YouTube channel called Estes Quest, and I'll put a link to Estes Quest and to the video that I'll be referencing today about this potential solve for the past and future box that this particular treasure hunter has proposed in California. This solve revolves around Mission Peak Regional Preserve is what it's called in the San Jose area. And I'll show you a couple of the clues that he found, which made him think of this solve, which I thought were quite interesting. So let me start my show here. Let's see. So it revolves around the word search, and a little section of the word search, which I'm showing on the screen here, is the section that has the word lyre or rail at the top, and it has the word line at the bottom of this region. And there is a word in the word search, square, which kind of led him on this particular task of trying to find a clue within a square somewhere. And so he picked out these 4 O's, which, again, we've talked about this quite a bit, but we don't really necessarily know what these leftover O's mean at this point. And there's 19 of them, which is interesting because 19 is in the word search as well as 0 or zeros. And so what do we do with these leftover zeros? This is using 4 of them, at least, the ones highlighted in blue here, to make a rectangle, technically.
I'm just waiting for Cody to jump in all over this one.
Like I said, I'm easy to get along with. Anyway, if you anagram the letters that make up the border of this 4-sided shape, you get the word interior wall. You can get the word interior wall. And then the thing that's not shown here is if you anagram the 8 letters in the middle of this shape, you get at reward. So he put that together and said, at reward, there's an interior wall. And so what he did next was Google interior walls. And of interest, let me change my picture. Of interest, he was able to find this park in California as one of the top hits that had these Native American structures that are built that have interior walls. And it's not really known what the function of these interior walls are. And it's a little close to home because we have a lot of these structures as well in New Mexico. And so I'll pull up an image of one in New Mexico because I think it highlights what these interior walls concept is. So let me pull this up. So here you can see some examples of these structures, and you can see they're pretty small. They're not like tall walls, but you can see there's a bunch of these interior walls in this structure, and there's not really any sign of like doorways or anything between quote unquote rooms here. And so this is why the interior walls is such an interesting clue potentially because of kind of the mysteriousness of these particular structures. So this one is in New Mexico just because I think it highlights that concept a little bit better than the images out of Mission Peak Regional Preserve. And so anyway, there's some of these structures in this Mission Peak Regional Preserve in California as well. And the reason Mission Peak is interesting is because Mission and Peak are both in the word search as well. So peak is one of the regular words that you can find just straight out of the box in the regular word search. And then there's been this phrase that's been decoded in some of the unused letters of the word search that says complete the mission. And so he put mission, which has kind of been unused at this point, and peak from the regular word search together to come up with Mission Peak. Thoughts or comments so far?
I like it. I mean, I guess my first flag was that the square would be a rectangle. But I guess if I'm thinking through having to use all these letters to fit together within the word search, I think I could be on board with that being fair. If that was the intention, it gets the point across that you were to use that shape cluster of the O's. I guess I'm trying to think through of like initially out of the gate how this can tie in with other aspects and clues of the word search, but this standalone I do like.
Yeah, so there's one more hint here. There is a particularly semi-famous post here in the park that you're seeing here on the upper right. That is, I don't know if that's artistic or what exactly the function of that post is, but post is mentioned in the cryptogram that's been solved in the past and future box as well. So there's post, there is mission peak, and then the other nugget here that I haven't mentioned was this particular rock wall at the bottom of the screen has a similar angle to the angle that's on the coin. So, but I agree that it doesn't necessarily line up with a lot of the clues in the word search or a lot of the words still, Bryn. Like, how do you use the numbers 3, 9, 19, 11, 12, etc. to get further along in this solve? So the other criticism I guess I have is you can see here from the landscape, there's not that many places to hide a treasure box either. So there are some wooded areas, but a lot of it is kind of flatlands as well. And so I will emphasize the same point that Estes Quest made, or Froggy made, in his video. And again, I'll link that video down, so full credit to him if you want to see the full solve. I'll link it at the bottom of however you're consuming this. He said those walls are archaeological sites, so you're not supposed to be touching them or defacing them in any way. So it's likely that the treasure box isn't really, touching those interior walls. Maybe it's somewhere around this park. So anyway, I thought it was an interesting solve. I like the use of mission because it hadn't been used in any of the solves I've seen so far. And linking that with mission peak, maybe a stretch just because we're not using a lot of the other clues. But I thought I'd throw it out there as something of interest that the audience might enjoy.
That is good. I guess when you're saying like part of an archaeological site, I get very hesitant of a location as soon as it's like something historic could become disrupted if someone were to think like, well, I have to be looking in this specific certain area. And I'm pretty sure JCB would be very intentional to not hide anything or give clues in a way that would infer that like anything is at a location that would lead someone to potentially like damage anything significant or historic.
Agreed. No, I think that's a point that's well taken, and the audience should heed as well.
I think what I like about this this theory or this solve in particular is that he gave himself clear limits of what's being anagrammed and a reason why. Because we know, I mean, I think there's a pretty good consensus right now that there are anagrams in the word search.
Right.
And I think that now that we know there's anagrams in there, if we don't find some reason or some way to create limits for what gets anagrammed, it gets out of hand very quickly. Just because once you just have a jumble of however many it is, like 250 or whatever letters, and you have very loose rules, and you can start putting together however you want, you can kind of create whatever message you want. So I like that whether it's a square or rectangle, he had a reason for using the letters he did for the anagram for the outside and then also for the inside. I think that lends a little bit more credibility to the method than to just start picking letters and anagramming away.
I mean, that alone, the fact that those two components, the border and the interior, anagram to something also relevant to a treasure hunt, I think also speaks volumes. That alone seems impressive to me. Very valid.
Yeah. No,
You buying your ticket, Bryn?
Yeah.
Book your tickets. Yeah, I guess that's my next question is, did he or is he planning on going boots on the ground?
I don't
Or
know.
is he still skeptical and acknowledging that there's more layers that need to be added in?
Yeah, I don't know if he went boots on the ground or not. I haven't heard any update on this particular solve yet. Um, I do definitely recommend his channel. He does quite a few different solves, so it might be solve of the day for him. And maybe he's moved on to other things. I'm not sure, but anyway, I thought it was cool. So cool. All right, should we dive into coincidence of the day?
All right. So coincidence of the day also ties into past and future box. And I'm realizing now this whole time we've been speaking, I've been holding open that chapter, and I don't really know why. I don't think I need to reference it. But so this coincidence is actually, I think, one of the first kind of things we came across in our initial attempt of finding meaning to these words that we found in the word search. So one of the words that stood out was lilac. And I think that's kind of a puzzling one. It just seemed a little mysterious and out of place alongside some of the other words in the word search. So we were doing a lot of Googling, trying to connect lilac to, old video games, old games in general, new video games, anything that we can kind of think of to try to figure out where this word would tie in. And so one thing we came across was something called the lilac illusion. And so the where it gets interesting is the chapter mentions JCB mentions Pac-Man, the game. He actually says, however, I was able to remember one game from my childhood that I felt capable of bringing to this book. It's not as fun as Pac-Man. So he kind of references like bringing a game into this chapter. He says not Pac-Man, but Pac-Man was on people's radar because it was mentioned, and I know there was people looking at like, can we overlay a Pac-Man board on top of the word search and get any information that way? So Pac-Man was top of mind. And so the lilac illusion can also be referred to as the Pac-Man illusion. So I'm just going to go ahead and read, oh gosh, a couple paragraphs here from the Wikipedia, which will explain it much more clearly than I can. The lilac chaser is a visual illusion, also known as the Pac-Man illusion. It consists of 12 lilac blurred discs arranged in a circle, like the numbers on a clock, around a small black centered cross on a gray background. So this gets interesting because in the word search, we have the cross in the center. And then we were also just talking about now making the connection with like the clock rotating around. We were just talking about that in Joyce's Serenade and the potential connection with the past and future box. So yeah, maybe a clock component with past and future. So yeah, there's a visual up on the screen now where you can see, kind of this green dot chasing around in a clockwise fashion around the purple dots. So for people just listening without the visual, it says one of the discs disappears briefly for about 0.1 seconds, then the next about 0.125 seconds later, and the next, and so on, in a clockwise direction. When one stares at this cross for at least 30 seconds, one sees three illusions. One, a gap running around the circle of lilac discs. Two, a green disc running around the circle of lilac discs in place of the gap. And three, the green disc running around on the gray background with the lilac discs having disappeared in sequence. So I don't know. I mean, I think the text that is kind of confusing to visual probably, but it's basically like it looks like there's a green dot chasing around the border of these dots, just like a clock hand going around quickly. So again, the cross in the center, the Pac-Man tie, and the lilac tie all made this very interesting. We're saying coincidence because we simply haven't found how this could be relevant. I also know, like, okay, well, the circles, right, thinking through, like, does that relate to the zeros or, anything in that way? But we just haven't been able to make a connection. So we have decided that as a coincidence. Do you guys have any other thoughts or context?
I think that cross seems to be pretty coincidency if true. Like, that seems like it's almost a dead giveaway that maybe this is irrelevant. And particularly thinking about Cody's Joy Serenade, where there was a mention of arc. Maybe we have to make a circular pattern with some of these letters to spell out a message, and I'm hoping it's not anagrams, but it probably is based on the word search. I guess I had done a little bit of arcing with the coin, the past and future box coin, and those hands that stick off of it. But maybe expanding that circle out a little bit, maybe that will give us a message. So stay tuned. I will work on that.
Yeah, and I almost wonder if the circles that make that like crosshair in the center of the word search, if that could be used for scaling at all. We've talked about issues with scaling in the past. If you can then, I don't know if there's like a published, this is the Lilac Chaser, size photo or video, but if you could then somehow match those, use those crosshairs overlaid on the O kind of crosshair pattern in the word search, if you could use that for scaling in some way.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's a coincidence of the day, but it's something that's still
So
in
it
the back
sounds
of our
like
mind, I think.
I think now that we're revisiting it, we're all deciding maybe it's not a coincidence.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
it does
definitely going to
seem.
look into that and see how you can, because it seems pretty clear that it's 12 circles. So looking for 12 letters, I think, seems very reasonable. It just
It's a
matters.
good amount of letters, yeah.
How to
And
determine the radius, I guess, is going to be the trick here.
yeah, I guess if you're thinking through, it would be 12 since referencing a clock. I think, yeah, you would just figure out how that could equally distribute itself out in an even way to make the 12 letters stand out.
It also seems like some people are thinking that every one of these words in the word search needs to be used or applicable to the solve. And if that's the case, it's a dang good use of the word lilac versus just somewhere that has lilacs, because lilac is not something that you're going to get a lot of references to like you would with 12
Line.
or something like that. Line.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Water.
Yeah, and the fact that it ties in with Pac-Man, the theme of the chapter. I don't know. All right, no longer a coincidence. I'm fully sold on this.
Going all in on Lilac Chaser.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I
don't
haven't seen any good uses of lilac that I've been happy with. So if we can use it in this way, let's look into it a bit more.
All right. If you're listening to this, you're not allowed to use lilac yet. We're still working on it.
We take it back. Edit this out.
Nope. Too late. We do it live. No editing. One take. All right. Cool. That is really great. I like that one a lot, and I'm liking it more and more now that we're discussing it.
Yeah. We're convincing ourselves of it.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Should we dive into the meat of the episode, chapter 11?
Let's do it.
All right. I am all out of sorts here. I'm on Joy's Serenade. 1 second. Let me get to the right chapter so I can quote it accordingly.
You should have just held your hand in place of the chapter for the first 40 minutes of this show.
All right. Chapter 11, Treasures from a Famous Shipwreck. And the subtext to this is the temptress greed. And we had talked a little bit about this in the last chapter, that he was going to talk about greed in this chapter based on the last one. There's only one quote associated with this. It says, "The world is big enough to satisfy everyone's needs, but will always be too small to satisfy everyone's greed." Mahatma Gandhi. So no lookup necessary for Gandhi. And this chapter is a little bit different. So something we haven't really seen before because it starts out with a story. So we call this story time. Montevideo. Yes. Montevideo, Brazil, July 3rd, 1752, 10 a.m. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, don't worry. So we start out with a story time that's referencing a captain named Felicia de Fonesca. There's 2 more days until his planned departure from Montevideo. And he describes Montevideo as a... Sorry about that. He describes Montevideo as a ragtag port that his ship has been waiting at for 10 months, doing resupply before they start their journey back to Portugal or Spain. I think it's Portugal, even though this work is being done for the King of Spain. They're trying to get their final food loaded up. The name of the ship is the Nuestra Senora de la Luz, or in English, Our Lady of the Light. They've been on this journey for 4 years, so it's been 4 years since they left Portugal. He had 12,500 minted gold coins that were loaded onto the ship. That was going to be a 50-50 split between the King of Spain. They were going to give half to him. And then the company that financed this particular voyage was going to keep the other half. And that was the agreement. And this 50-50 split was with King Ferdinando VII of Spain. But there was some smuggled coins on this ship as well. There was about 200,000 pesos worth of gold that had also been smuggled in some barrels deep in the powder hold of this ship. And so there was some corruption going on that they were going to smuggle some coins back for the company and the captain themselves as well. There's also 40 large gold bars and discs that were associated with this smuggled treasure as well. The ship was at the port in Buenos Aires for 3 years prior, before they moved to Montevideo for the resupply. And Buenos Aires was where there was better rum and beautiful women, which were lacking in Montevideo, supposedly, according to this story. The story goes on, and this is kind of from the captain's perspective. He thought about his friend Pedro de Luz, who had been coordinating the collection of the minted coins for the company that financed this voyage. And there was 2 sources of the coins that were being loaded onto the ship. One is machine pressed coins from Santiago, and there was a load of hand pressed coins from Lima. Captain Fonesca did not like Pedro's constant worrying, however, and Pedro was complaining about how the ship was overloaded. And it wasn't just overloaded because of the smuggled that added to the problem, but there was just an overloading of cargo in general. At this point, the story mentions that the wind was picking up, and Pedro barged into Captain Fonesca's room, and he says, "Pampero, Pampero." They both ran out to the pier. And noticed that the wind was getting stronger and stronger. And what a pampero is a strong summer wind in this region of the world that can reach up to 180 kilometers per hour. So there was a storm brewing. And they have this overloaded ship in the middle of the ocean, about 3 miles offshore. And so they decided they needed to get out to the ship and raise the anchors so they could try to weather the storm out in the ocean, so it wasn't anchored and just getting battered. There was 130 people on the ship already. The captain was not. He was on land. And so they tried with his crew of 4 people to row out to the main ship, and they got about 200 yards or 300 yards in 30 minutes. Because the wind was just pushing them too quickly. So they kind of gave up on that, went back to shore as they were going back to shore, they saw that the people on board the ship raised the anchor and started sailing. They had the same mindset. And they were going to try to ride the current so that the waves didn't just destroy the ship. When they got back to shore, the captain used his telescope to look out and saw that the Lady of the Light was drifting away. And that's kind of the end of the story time. And then we get a few more facts about what happened to that ship. So on July 3rd, 1752, the Lady of the Light was sunk off the coast of Brazil, and the wreckage was distributed over 50 miles. And none of the 130 passengers survived this shipwreck. The year following the shipwreck, about 90% of the accounted for cargo was recovered with the help of the captain. But the smuggled treasure was not recovered because it wasn't supposed to exist. So he did not help with the recovery of the smuggled treasure that was lost. Jon Collins-Black mentions that the waters in this area are extremely dangerous, and there's been over 1,000 shipwrecks in this area over the course of history. So, very dangerous area. Keeping the ship here for many months was dangerous and fueled by the greed of the captain and the financiers of the ship to get the smuggled gold loaded. About 200 to 300 years later, I didn't do the math, in 1993, the wreckage of the smuggled treasure was actually found by Senor Ruben Correa while he was searching for another shipwreck called the Presidio. And so the smuggled gold was finally recovered several hundred years later. And it was found about 50 miles away from Montevideo, the original starting point of that ship. Then JCB talks about what treasure is in the treasures that he's hidden. So he was able to acquire 3 pieces of treasure from this particular shipwreck. One is a gold bar, and it's pictured in the chapter. That's over 23 troy ounces. There's a gold disc of highly pure gold. That's over 22 troy ounces. And then there's an 8 escudos coin that was hand-pressed from the Lima Mint. That's also part of the treasure. And then he gives into some of his lessons. What can we learn from the story? He says that greed is nobody's friend. Greed is a seductress, luring us into bad decisions and misguiding us from things that bring us joy. JCB's biggest concern when designing this hunt was tempting people towards irrational actions. So talking about kind of his fears associated with creating this treasure hunt, that people might put themselves in dangerous situations. So at this point, he emphasizes that he placed all 5 treasure boxes in safe locations. You don't have to risk life or limb to recover them. So don't be going on cliff faces or anything like that to find these treasures. They're accessible for regular people like you and me. The story reminds us not to put the readers in needlessly dangerous situations, unlike what the Lalus did. And then he mentions that there's a postscript at the end of the book that talks about best practices for finding his treasures. And we will cover that at some point over the course of this podcast, but not tonight. Then he talks about greed is not necessarily as what you see on TV or movies, but greed can grow from a feeling of scarcity. And Jon Collins-Black mentioned he's fallen to greed several times himself, but he does not go into any details about what those events might be. And that's about it. That's the end of the chapter. You guys have any questions or comments generally about chapter 11?
I would say just generally it was it stood out, like you mentioned, as just being a different format than the other chapters, starting with this narrative. Really caught me off guard when I flipped to this chapter to start reading. So I guess I don't know what specifically he felt like needed to be conveyed in this way. He certainly could have spoken to, I think, the situation in a similar way that he was writing about, the other chapters as well. So trying to think through why that intentional choice was made.
That was my first thought as well. Like you articulated exactly what I was thinking, like 2 paragraphs into that chapter. Another thing that's kind of, I'll call it general, even though it's going to be a very specific comment. I'm sure it's not related to any takeaways, but when I picture pirate ships being like anchored, I picture them like a couple 100 feet offshore, right? So when he said it's anchored 3 miles offshore, that's just it stood out to me, not as a clue, but just as my understanding of how pirate ships were anchored is just not correct.
It's not a pirate ship, Cody. It was a ship commissioned by the King of Spain and a finance company.
I knew that, but I was picturing it in my head as a pirate ship.
So yeah, I did a little bit of research into this area of the world. So Montevideo, it's located at a port called Rio de la Plata, which roughly translates into a plate, but the plate references like gold or silver as plate. So it's kind of like a metal reference, not a dish reference, let's say. And so it's actually a gigantic bay where multiple rivers are converging and going out into the ocean. And so my guess is that that makes it unsuitable for having ships close to land because of the currents that are probably associated with that river. So that's my guess, my speculation as to why the ship is anchored so far out is probably because of the geography there and the currents there. Probably make it a little bit unsuitable for anchoring close to land. That's your fun fact of the day.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, just commenting on the format of this chapter. I mean, my guess is a little bit of artistic license here. Maybe he wanted to mix it up. Maybe he wanted to try storytelling from a first-person perspective of this captain. I don't know. Maybe this was the first chapter he wrote. Maybe this was a middle chapter that he wrote. Maybe it was the last one and he wanted to try something a little different. We'll see if we run into this narrative style later in the book or not. But yeah, it definitely is the easiest thing to point out in terms of what makes this chapter unique.
Yeah.
All right. Do you guys have other commentary or should we dive right into our Forrest Fenn Picked Nuggets?
I'm excited for those FFPNs.
You are? Okay. Let us start FFPNs.
Wow.
Okay. Who wants to go first? Any volunteers?
I'm happy to go first just because mine's quick.
Okay.
So I know throughout some of these chapter discussions, we've been talking about the numbers specifically used and how they are written out, if they're the numbers themselves or if it's written out as a word. And so there was 2 instances of what felt like weird moments to be using written words versus the numbers, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So when he said 50-50 split, he actually wrote out 50-50. I guess 50/50, sorry. And so I guess that seemed a little unusual. I guess I wouldn't have thought to write it that way. And then he also, when the wind was picking up, he wrote out trees bent at 45 degrees. So I don't know. Both of those instances just stood out to me as being a little off and interesting. So I wasn't sure if those were 2 numbers that we were supposed to be paying attention to. So 50 and then 45. Also, just like saying the trees bent at 45 degrees seemed oddly specific. I guess it is a good, strong visual, but it seemed like there was more that he was trying to convey there.
Yeah, I actually did not pick up on that, but I could read that 2 ways. One, we somewhat have a running theory that the numbers throughout the book are important, and so maybe those numbers were written out so you didn't need to use them, and then you use the numbers that are written in numerical form only, and that was a way to avoid putting extra numbers in that might not lead to something. Or they're written out because they're important just for the opposite reason. Like ignore the numbers that are written numerically and use the numbers that are written out using letters. I don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I guess I just keep having my eye out for that.
Yeah, I think we need to do a deep dive on that at some point, and look into it more, because that's not what I had for my nugget, but it is a flake of mine that I had.
Okay.
Was just the sheer volume of numbers in this chapter. It seemed very dense with numbers, and then like Bryn was saying, I just noticed that I didn't look at it closely enough to try and pick out like his reasoning for using numbers versus text, written out numbers. But it seems like, yeah, like Brendan was saying, like there's some back and forth there, and he's not following the same rules, and that there could be an intention behind that. So I think it's something we should take some time and look into here. Yeah, but yeah, I really like that FFPN, Brendan.
Yeah. Sorry, it doesn't really lead to much, but I thought it was still noteworthy.
I think it's very noteworthy, even outside of just this chapter, but it really stood out in this chapter.
Right. I'll volunteer to go next since mine is also number related. And I thought it was going to be the same when you started, but it's different. So I am pointing out the pictures in the book with the numbers on them. So the 2 gold bar, or the 1 gold bar, has some Roman numerals on it. It has 2 X's, which could be a 10. And then on the other side of the gold bar, it has 3 X's, a V, and an I, so 36. Obviously, these are artifacts from Shipwreck, and so Jon Collins-Black can't, change them to be whatever number that's important. But we had seen, potentially some Roman numerals when we did a cipher shift of the word search. That's shifted to a lot of Roman numeral based letters when we did that. Not quite sure what to make of that yet. So that caught my eye right off the bat. And then on the disc, which is on page 107, there's also some Roman numerals. So there's a 14 in Roman numerals, XIV, and then again on the other side there's 2 X's. I don't know if those are actually Roman numerals because they're written like a little bit differently, it looks like, but I don't know if that's supposed to represent 20 or XX was something else. But the thing that caught my eye on the gold disc was there's also 3 stars on the top left of one face of this gold disc. And so that just caught my eye because we had been talking previously about space, that space probe, the Vega space probe. And so I don't quite know what to make of it. I don't have a good conclusion for this other than the stars on that gold disc caught my eye because we had been talking about UV and the sun and space as a theme, bit of a theme previously. So that's my FFPN.
I've been having like such an eye for anything like space and stars, moons. And when I saw these stars, I just thought, oh, that's cute. What a nice little touch on this coin.
Yeah, I'll re-emphasize because it's a historical artifact, it's hard to know whether he targeted this particular artifact because it had certain numbers or certain symbols on it. It seems a bit of a stretch to me, but you never know if he seeked these out on purpose.
Well, I think it's a topic we touched on in one of our first podcasts, like the second or third one, where we said, hey, if he's taken a photo of or includes a photo of, an existing historical artifact or whatever, do you think that it's outside of the his own rules to alter a photo to include a clue in it? I think we had mixed
I said yes.
Yeah,
mixed takes on that.
I was a hard no that he would not alter a photo of an artifact.
I think it's
Yeah,
possible.
and I was kind of
unlikely in this situation, I would say.
I was kind of 50-50. I almost think it's more likely if it's an artifact that there wouldn't be like common pictures circulated around of it. Like I think the Bitcoin and the Charizard and stuff, you can find those. You can, I mean, just pull it up and Google it, and there it is. I'm not sure. I didn't try with these like gold bricks. I imagine that they're probably more obscure to the general public. So maybe something where you could just Photoshop in a little couple extra Roman numerals in there to make it fit what you need. But I'm not saying that I think he did that, but it just reminds me of that conversation we had early on.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Good point. All right, Cody, hit us with your FFPN.
Here's my FFPN. You're probably going to want to check out the book to look at this. Page 106. It's the 1, 2, 3, 4, like the fifth paragraph down, second line. Incrustations from the ocean still fill and extra the crevices of its surface, the gold. That is the quote. I'll read it again. Incrustations from the ocean still fill and extra the crevices of its surface, period, the gold. That's the line. There's a typo on it, but I don't care about the typo that much. I think it's probably just a typo.
Yeah.
What immediately jumped out to me with that line is it seems very crammed, like text wise. Like the spacing is like all smashed together. I'm not sure what the proper word for that is. Which seems very relevant to me because we've talked a couple times about like, would he try and like line it up so like the first line, the first word of every line or the last word of every line is something, or hyphens, or a lot of different kind of theories or ideas revolving around the spacing of where actual words land on the page.
Yeah.
So this one, I did a little looking into this one. First, I typed out that line and then found other similar lines where there aren't like, where it's just also just kind of text and not like numbers or weird like italics or anything. And I put a few of those lines up as references, and then this one on like a Word document. And I changed the font size and changed the different texts. I changed the different sizes and then changed to a bunch of different fonts. And every time this line like hangs way further out than all the other lines. Like there's just more characters in it. So then I counted the characters. There's 86 characters in that line. And then I counted 2 more nearby that again are kind of similar with just mostly lowercase text. And I got 78 and 77, which is a difference of between, that's 8 or 9 character difference. But this line has the word gold at the end, which is only 4 characters. Why the heck wasn't gold on the next line? It would have all spaced out better. Like this seems like, and it also seems like something that the software would have automatically formatted it so that gold is just on the next line.
Right.
It seems like it would have had to be something that like manually overridden to smash everything together like that.
There's more to this. There's more to the story here, Cody, and I think Bryn wants to say something, and I want to say something before you go too much off the rails here.
Am I going off the rails?
Yeah. So looking at the ebook, does that line look visually squished?
Yes.
Okay. In the physical book, it does not.
Yeah,
really?
the physical book. Let me read the quote from the physical book because actually I saw someone mention this online.
Really?
Incrustations from the ocean still fill the crevices of its surface. So in the first edition printing of the book, there's 2 thes, and then somebody wrote extra, and then that did not get, because there's an extra the, that didn't get edited out in your version, the second version of the book.
Wait, so yours says
Still
oceans still fill the crevices.
Yes.
And my version says oceans still fill an extra the crevices.
Yeah, that's from the editing process is the understanding.
Oh my gosh.
So sorry that you went really deep. I didn't want to interrupt.
No, it's I mean, obviously it sounds like this is gonna end up just being like you said, a weird editing glitch.
Yeah.
And not a clue.
Yeah.
But it's still interesting. So yeah, so there would have been the extra the in the book by accident. Would have gone and they would have like put a little note in there and crammed it into that sentence for someone to fix, and then they never fixed it and just published the ebook. And then they also forgot to include Joy's Serenade in the ebook. In the part 2.
Now I'm more confident.
Watch your mouth.
All right. So this is the first. This is the first confirmed incorrect FFPN.
Sorry, Cody.
No,
I
it's
was
all good.
very confused when I was looking up that line in the book.
I didn't see the extra when I was reading it. My eyes just made
I
it
didn't
into
either.
one. But yeah, I think you got a glimpse of the proofreading of either Jon Collins-Black, or because the book was already out, he might have had another proofreader, but then that comment didn't get erased in the ebook version. I'm assuming that will be fixed in future versions of the book, though.
Yeah, it seems like that is definitely what happened. Well, all right. There's my FFPN. It's a good yeah, if anyone's wondering what's going on there, we've solved the case.
Yep.
And if you feel bad for missing the when you were reading it, mine says again, still fill an extra the crevices. And I read that like 3 times and like was still working on like just the counting the characters before I even realized that it didn't make any sense.
That's because it visually looked strange.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So, okay. Well, I like that that I was able to catch something like that. And it's yeah, it makes me feel better for the future knowing that I caught something, even though it had already been caught.
You had a keen eye for that particular typo. Good job.
That's really funny.
Anybody have any flakes that you want to bring up?
Yeah, I guess I would just note a couple quick things that stood out. Obviously the wind connection here. I think we've picked up on wind themes a few times. Obviously the wind was just a very critical part of the story versus an added. But want to call that out. And then also just the ship name, Our Lady of the Light.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of just piqued my interest with like the lighthouse connections that we've been making. Seems like obviously once again it's not something that he could dictate here, but whether or not he chose to include the story and these artifacts for some greater reason in how he wanted to structure the hunt.
Yeah, my flake is related to that as well. Lady of the Light. I went in and that one was translated in the book. I'd also looked at the Rio de la Plata to look for that translation. That's how I brought up the particular geography, Cody. But I put in Lady of the Light USA in Google, and what came back was exciting to me because there's a Lady of the Light chapel in Santa Fe, New Mexico that I've been to. Ooh. Actually, the Loretta Chapel, and it's famous, and that was the top hit for when I Googled Lady of the Light USA. It was one of the top hits. I actually don't know if it was the exact top hit, but it was one that caught my eye. There's maybe another Catholic church somewhere in the U.S. called Lady of the Light, or a handful of those. Anyway, the Loretta Chapel is famous because of a freestanding spiral staircase that was constructed, I think, in the 1800s by a mysterious carpenter that never took payment and disappeared after constructing the staircase. And it's just a spiral staircase that goes up about probably 10 to 15 foot altitude change. And there's no like supporting structure under it. It's a one piece. And I had heard that they had tried to figure out what type of wood it was made out of, and they could not with like DNA sequencing. So very mysterious.
I remember you telling us about that like a year or two ago.
Yeah.
Weren't they saying that they like also like couldn't, like it wasn't constructible by like methods of the time, and he just like did it when no one was looking and disappeared?
Yep.
Another mystery to solve.
So another mystery. So that's why it's a nugget. I don't really have a way to connect that to anything. But it was a coincidence of interest that came about from some Googling of Lady of the Light. All right. Any other flakes between you two?
I will add that. So, I mean, this I guess ties in with the whole, I guess I'd say part 1. I haven't looked into part 2 yet, but I did see on Discord, and someone had messaged me as well, that they were keeping an eye out for X's, hidden X's in the illustrations, or I guess I should say in the pictures. And so I hadn't really looked into it. And when they said pictures, I was kind of looking at more of the photographs, thinking maybe an X was hidden in there, in like all the imagery within the book. And so coming across this image here in chapter 11 was the first time that I noticed a hidden X that stood out to me. And then I realized, well, maybe it just applies to all the more like illustration type images within the book. So I did see hidden X. How would I describe that? So
This
if
is
you kind
in
of look
the
at
picture of the ship in the
the
chapter.
picture of the ship on page 101 in the
Okay.
physical book,
which is not a pirate ship, even though you may
not
think
a
it's a
pirate ship.
pirate ship.
I don't know what to call that big like mast sticking out the front. But if you go straight down and like the waves, there's a
Oh,
little cross uh, down there.
yeah, there
And so
is.
I then kind of went back and looked at other illustrations, and I was able to find X's hidden in most of the illustrations. I won't say not all of them, but I haven't like really dug into it too deep yet. So I don't know if that's I don't think it's a coincidence. Obviously, it stands out more as out of place in some of the images than others because some of the illustrations are more like line based, where I think maybe this one stood out because it just doesn't quite fit in with the drawing style itself quite as well. So, yeah, just something for us to be keeping an eye out. Again, I have no idea how this is going to be helping us, but potentially some clues for us to tie together.
So this one is in the negative space. Have the other ones been in the negative space that you found as well? Or are they in the line
No,
drawings like X's specifically?
in the like the lines, the not negative space.
Okay.
The positive
Um,
space.
yeah, I don't know. Is that the right way of saying that?
I don't know.
Pirate ship.
So, anyways, just something for us to be keeping an eye out as these illustrations pop up. Yeah, and I think worthy of going back to try to find them as well, because presumably they would all be coming together to give us something.
Yeah. All right.
I like that a lot. It's the kind of thing where, like, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
On that ship one. Very interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a great find. I'm another task for me. Go back and look for those X's and moving forward as well. We talk a little bit about themes, Cody.
Yeah, I think the only two that are really applicable to this chapter, the wind, that one's strong ties to wind, and then water/salt water. Yeah, I don't think he could have wrote a chapter on this topic without it. So
Right.
that one's in there. None of the other ones really. Kind of one of our biggest one throughout the last few chapters was that transcending circumstances one. Don't think that is applicable.
Agreed. But maybe because this chapter is about bad things, greed, you didn't want to include it or couldn't.
Yeah. Do you want to let the folks know what's coming up on the next episode real quick?
Oh yeah, so we've recorded 6 regular chapter episodes now, so next episode will be a part 2 box special bonus episode. We're going to be doing the Pokemon box for our next episode, so stay tuned for that. I'm going to be relying heavily on Cody for his Pokemon knowledge as I bring up my points to discuss, so Cody, get ready.
Oh boy. Could be a hard listen.
No, I think I'm really excited for another part 2. I think we didn't really know what to expect as we started our Forrest Fenn episode, and I think that really came together nicely as far as us all getting some good information out of it by discussing it together. So hopefully we can do the same for Pokemon.
Right. People have tips or comments or questions, feel free to shoot us an email, tips.ttiunofficialpodcast tips.ttiunofficialpodcast@gmail.com. You'll find that email address below, however you're consuming this content. Obviously, as I mentioned last episode, we get a lot of good goodies in our inbox there, and sharing all of those that people are willing to share. So keep them coming, and hopefully you will hear your name on a future episode of the podcast. All right. Have a good night, everybody. Happy hunting.
Searching for clues, let's find you.